All right, so I guess, yeah, everybody, welcome. This is the SoCal PowerShell user group. I suppose I'll do a shout out to my sponsors first. Sapien for sponsoring the pizza, which there's plenty of it out there, and it's here ahead of the meeting this time. So I can thank them for that. And then Lone Depot for the facility. Like, this is a community-driven user group, but Lone Depot is becoming sponsors for the facility and tools we have here. So today, I want to do like a back to the basics, like talk about functions and advanced functions. If you know, so all of my presentations, I always put them on GitHub. I like that because I can always just commit to my most latest. And what I really like about it is that at any time, somebody can just go download a zip and they get the files locally if they're not as comfortable with, work with source control. So So taking it, and then I suppose about me, like I said, I've been running this group here for about 1.5 years. I'm now a PowerShell MVP, and I'm very active on this, PowerShell subreddits. So I guess we'll just kind of jump into it here. And I'm probably going to lose my voice by the end of the night, I'm sure of it. Okay, so functions. So let's kind of like back to the basics. Like, you've probably been using commandlets and functions already. Like in a way, like get date is basically a function that somebody else wrote. And as we run it, we get output. Pretty simple stuff along that lines. And then, functions take parameters. And if we do get help on our function, we should see like syntax that says, here's all of the options and parameters available to a specific function. And yeah, so lots of options. And then get command will always show us all available functions that are already loaded in your session. So looking at the most basic of functions, here I've created the simplest one that does, write green dates. So I'm going to take somebody else's function and wrap it in something so that I can kind of make a nice, easy, simple command in order to execute the same thing. So as I load this, let me pause and disable one of my extensions here. I love getlens unless I am presenting. Let's disable this workspace. And then also, that's file preferences. So I'm trying to swap my theme here. I got to change. There we go. Let's grab a light. And then since I reloaded, gotta prep the demo again. Perfect. Okay, now I'm set to continue. So if I run my first function, and I'm pretty much just highlighting it to load it. Like when I press F8 or run, it's going to load this in my session, and I can just call it over and over with something else. So as simple as we can get, a function is a way to just like take a piece of code, you want to use it over and over, and abstract it out. That's probably I'll touch on naming a little bit. The general rule of thumb is you use that noun or that verb dash noun type naming, and there is a list of pre-approved verbs. If you ever get into building modules, you'll get warnings and it'll start complaining if you actually use verbs that aren't part of this list. There's quite a few of them, sometimes it's tough to find the right one that meets your needs, and there's some online documentation that tells you probably should be using whatever what. I don't know. I find myself using invoke a lot because I can't find a better verb, but that's just how it goes. Yep, invoke get. All right, so then parameters. So if you want to get information into your functions, because it becomes like a template, right? So the parameter block is the preferred way to specify a parameter. If you come from other languages, you might actually see somebody creates their parameters like this instead, which works, but I don't think you get some of the niceties that PowerShell offers that you did if you actually use the param block. So I'm just going to cut that out. If we load this guy, this guy here is going to write messages in green. And then here, if we run these, we get both of these messages. So these become the parameters that feed into my function. And then we can actually have functions that call functions, right? There's nothing, I mean, actually, it's really encouraged to have, I can use one function that calls the other one. So let's continue on.
Right host. Install that host by on show.
So actually, so I could break functions and scripts into two different categories, right? I got my tools and my controller scripts. So like controller scripts are my user needs to be prompted for stuff. I need to have lots of robot output to kind of give them the touchy feel like, okay, I see what's happening. But then your tools are the ones that get consumed by everything else. Like they give you objects because like if you build a tool or a function that can be used in a very generic way, you'll be surprised at how often you can use it for so many different things. And as I get into some of these more advanced features, you'll kind of start to see how some of that comes to light. And like so, and here's a simple script that you might write or see. Like here's an example of somebody writing and creating a shortcut. And you might have like a system setup script that might have these 4 lines of code just kind of like pasted in there to kind of get the system up and going. And as I run this, just to see that it works, no errors. And I got a little cleanup helper here. And I'm going to run this over and over just to delete the shortcuts. So there was the notepad link that was created. But then as you add to it, you very quickly, you'll see the script just grow. You're like copying and pasting almost the same thing. And that's when we start thinking, if I'm copying and pasting something, that's the first time you want to think, hey, a function could probably be the solution to not copy and paste that. So, it was. It's a very quick function. In fact, I can, no smoke and mirrors here. I didn't do the noun verb because it's just for the demo. But I'm going to be creating these same 4 shortcuts over and over. And we're just going to walk through, write verbose to say I'm removing it, and remove the item. I'm using a little hack here to say always write verbose true versus using a write host. This way, this is a controller script, if you will. And I have to specify the verbose flag if I want to see that output. And he's checked into the project. Okay, so as I run this chunk of code, no errors. Run my cleanup, I'll see that all 4 of those shortcuts were created in this case. So as I see that, there's a pattern. Let's create a function out of it, right? So the first thing I do when I'm creating a function is to extract my variables out. Like the things that I want to change, I'll make them a variable at the top of the script. So it's really easy to see that once I take those 2 lines out, those 2 variables, that the rest of it truly is cookie cutter code. And that's what you're looking for when you're writing a function, is something that could be cookie cutter. So and it still works, no errors. And we clean up, I'll see that it deleted that file. So making an actual shortcut out of it is now just literally putting those variables under param block. And these are pretty much the same lines I had up above, adding some more verbosity, and this is specifically for this demo. So when we run this new shortcut now, I've cleaned up what it looks like to create that shortcut. And while the first bit of code really wasn't that hard to decipher, I think it's much more clear when you actually see this as a function name, new shortcut. And one thing I use quite heavily my function for is like self-documenting my code. Like sometimes if I think that thing is just ugly, even if it's just 2 or 3 lines, I'll put the thing in a function so it tells whoever's reading it, I'm just creating a shortcut. And I can debug, I can step past it, I don't have to worry about it because I know what that line is doing.
I've actually done exactly what you're talking about. So I saw a column object, what you said was in there. What I done, it was like some obscure .NET function that removed, that deallocated like column objects like PowerShell, just like that.
Yeah.
Literally, all I do is pass the column object like as a parameter, so it's just some object, and all it does is deallocate it. And the only reason for that is because it was so obscure I can never remember it. Literally 1 line of code, like a synopsis, and that's it. So I can
Absolutely.
speak to what you're saying.
Because if I don't have to think about the comm objects, I don't want to. You know, like that new shortcut is something I can debug and step past and not think twice about until it's causing issues. Then I'll dive into the weeds. And then, well, I'm not showing it here. I can now add all kinds of validation around this, right? Like what happens if I try to create a shortcut to something that doesn't exist? So now I got like 3 more lines that says, test, does this path exist? You know, if not, how do I communicate that back? Or if I'm saving to a location that's bad, now I can test my location. Is it valid? So now this function can kind of grow on its own. And those growing pains, you learn them, you put them in your function. Now everybody that called that now benefits from those enhancements and those changes. Because as soon as, you know, if I go back to this original script here, if I want to start testing my paths, I'm copying and pasting that test 4 times. And I want to test the output, I copy and paste that 4 times. And you would see how super quickly this is like, what? Where am I at? This one here was really ugly, right? Yeah. So something like this. My hotkey's not working right. You know what? I'm not going to. There it is. Okay. So all of a sudden, we're doing something more like, well, and I've got these paths hard-coded in there, right? So now we got to say, okay, so now I need to have a, you know, local path. And what I really need is, I was gonna get crazy on that. But you can see how complicated I get really fast if I actually wanted to write out all of those paths and tests. So our function, this place here, we're gonna just do it in 1 line. Right? If test path, target file. You know, and I just saved 1 error. And I'm a firm believer of, like, if something is throwing an error or an exception, let me actually test for that condition and just mitigate it versus letting the error just kind of build up and make a lot of noise. So we'll go ahead and save that. Okay. Actually, that should be saving. Yeah, that's fine. Okay. So continuing on. Clean up. Now, this still looks kind of messy, copying and pasting this same thing 4 times. But it's kind of hard to escape some of this, right? Because in a way, my names are changing each time, and I'm calling a little shortcut. Maybe we could put it into like a spreadsheet. So instead of, so now, like once you get this function, this pattern, you can start seeing other ways to abstract away those patterns. So here's an idea of, I put everything into a CSV, and my CSV has the list of paths and destinations. And now we can just easily loop over this and create all the shortcuts. And this is the idea of building tools. Like now, new shortcut is no longer a controller script. It's a tool that can be used and reused across different projects versus you know, the other thing I had before. All right, let's clean that up. And that is the end of that file. So let's take a look at other function features. Oh. Okay. So pipeline output. So by default with PowerShell, PowerShell makes heavy use of the pipeline. And what that means is anything that kind of gets like left on the command line or in function, like I just call it the number, kind of like just falls out of the function. Like that data comes back out. And you see that like whenever I run just the for each, right, you see these numbers kind of just fall out to my console. And the same thing happens with functions. Like if I load this, and if I call my function, and I check the count of how many objects I have, all 6 of those were kind of returned. So just by placing stuff on the pipeline, they kind of fall out of the function that can be captured. Because when I check my data now, I would see my numbers, 10 through 15, which matches my loop here. So that's important to know that everything on the pipeline is output, because if you start having, like messages, like this string gets returned, this object gets returned, this string. So sometimes you'll see yourself, running your function, and you get other things popping out here that you're not expecting. So if I put this into a variable, thinking I'm getting, just this BIOS information, I can see the first line is that first string. The second line would be that object. So that's kind of like an awareness thing of stuff falls out of the pipeline into your variables pretty easily. I suppose the biggest gotcha is like sometimes you're returning a certain value. And I'll get to the return keyword later. But I really want to call this out when you're calling like legacy.net object functions and methods. I like to give return values. So sometimes I say this thing .delete, and it returns like a true or a false, or a 0 and a 1. That falls in your pipeline. So if you're not like catching it with a void or a null, for instance. So if I go off on that tangent, we do data equals system dots collections dot, is that not right? Collection dot, I think, no, it's array list. Sorry, going off script here. Yeah, I'll come back to that. I'm a very copy and paste scripter. Like half my blog is examples for me to grab later. So I'm always referencing my own blog for these snippets of code. Like I wrote about that once. Yeah. Only that one's demo guides. Okay. So the way I account for that then is I use verbose output quite a bit more often. So actually, ideally, when I write functions or tools anyways, my output is usually tends to always be a rich object, and all of my messaging, I usually use like verbose to get those messages out. So here's an idea where I'm thinking, okay, let's use the right verbose. But when we load this function, and then I run this, we'll notice right away that I didn't actually get any verbose output, right? So my data only has my one object, right? That's verbose. My data just has my one object, so I'm not leaking into my objects, but I still have I don't have any verbosity. So logically, I'll say, you know what, let me call this verbose flag. And you know what, I still don't get any verbose output. And this is where you shift from functions to advanced functions, right? So now there's a quick hack, is you can say the verbose preference says continue, and I run this, and I actually get a verbose. Like this globally, it says anywhere there's a verbose line, make sure it's output. I'm gonna put it back to the silent and continue as the default, and we're gonna look at our first advanced function. And really what makes the function advanced is by adding this commandlet binding. It adds lots of features you can take advantage of in your functions. I pretty much always add this guy by default, just about everything I craft and write. And one of the things he adds is support for verbose. So just because I'm calling it a function doesn't mean I can actually use it. But here's the case where now that I have this loaded, and my normal verbose is still the same, no output, verbosity, but now this flag will, let's jump on me, but this flag will now show the verbosity. So a lot of my functions do no output at all. And as you're building tools that consume tools that consume tools, in a way you almost want the default to be not noisy chatter. Because all of a sudden you're deploying 280 components across 13 environments, and you get these messages that just multiply in insane ways. You can't even see what's even happening anymore. So all of a sudden, if you keep that in verbose stuff, you can turn that stuff on and off as needed. So let's go on to, oh, and then we add some common parameters. So if I test the syntax, check the syntax now for this guy, it's going to actually say that common parameters are now supported. Gas verbose is a common parameter. And I've got a document here that links out to all the common parameters for reference. And while we're talking about verbosity, let's talk about just writing messages. So here's like the whole permutation of messages that you may want to potentially write. So the first one here is in a controller script, right, where nobody's consuming the objects. I can probably just toss strings on the pipeline and get output and consume. So this first guy, is hidden behind my tooltip, is exactly that, a string on the pipeline. The second one, I'm using the word write output. The guy is doing the same thing. It's putting everything in the pipeline. It's almost redundant in this example. Sometimes people like to make the case. Hey, come on in. Thanks. Some people like to make the case that, if you're returning values on a pipeline, maybe you should put write output there, so you know as a note to yourself that that's what you intend. I've kind of been in that camp for a long time, but I finally just fell back on, it's like that false sense of security, right? Like you can have things that accidentally put stuff in the pipeline, and now you're hiding it from yourself if you don't expect it, or if you only expect it with the right output, you're allowing yourself to fall for those traps. So I do less write output now than I used to. So it depends on how old my script is. You might see lots of those write outputs. Anything in the last year or so, probably not. Write host. This guy writes directly to the console. And what's important about that is that it's hard to capture that. Like he's literally writing pixels on the screen. Like that's the idea of write host is. So it's hard to capture and redirect the output because he's saying there's a buffer of the screen. I'm writing to the host. The nice thing is you can do pretty colors, right? So this guy here will make him green. they've added with PowerShell 5, I think, is write information, which he acts quite a write host and write information are very tightly related. Write information allows you to decide, am I writing to the screen or not, but also gives you the option to output to a variable. So you can actually capture output from the write information. And I suppose there's a lot of caveats with write host. I think you can now capture it to variables with some parameters starting with PowerShell 5. So it used to be one of those where they say, this kills puppies, don't be using write host. But now PowerShell 5, they're like, you know what, we can deal with it. So we're not going to freak out so much when you use it. Write verbose, we've already seen that. Write debug is just another layer of verbosity. I'm going to loop back and talk about him individually because he has some weird nuances. That's why I got this little asterisk here. Write warning is another channel, write error. And then the stop all execution, the throw exception. So if we load this function and see what these messages look like. Okay. So here I'm using information action to say continue. That actually tells write information to actually output something. If I left that off, we'd never see that message. All right, so let me run this guy here, and we'll take a look at how these things look in our console. So these first couple here, the first two are my pipeline. I'm missing another tool real quick here. Tools, system internals, zoom it. Okay, so like I said, these first two were, write host or on the pipeline and write outputs. Here's our host message. Here was our write information. Then our verbose, our warning, and then we get to the error message. It starts like throwing us like more information about what line it was and what type of error it was. You can specify your own fully qualified ID. There's a lot of things you can do with errors. And then the exception is very similar, but it stops execution unless you catch it. So there's the idea of like you can throw an error, and if you don't catch it, somebody else has to catch it, or the script exits. So if we take a closer look at some of these. So if I want to capture this stuff into a variable and see how things change, I'm going to skip the exceptions for this one because it would actually prevent the output from returning the way I want it to. So if we run this line now and look at our output first, we see our write host made it out there and the write warning and the error message. Those are the only three messages of that list that made it out to my display. So if we take a peek at what made in my data, we'll see that the two that were placed in the pipeline were the ones that we were able to capture. So we can use this for the write information and write host now. We can use this information variable to capture that and do something with it later. So if somebody wrote a controller script and they should have wrote a tool, you can call it, save their output to a variable, and then parse it and walk it however you need to. This doesn't get used much, but it's an option, I suppose, is let's look at it. So if I run this guy now, our first write host, the warning and the error still leak out to the console, which is appropriate. And now my info stream has the first write host and then the second one that write information. So it's a way to capture those things and do something with them. And then there are lots of ways to control the other features, like you can tell your warning actions, ignore these, I don't want to see those. Information variables, the same variable from before, and then same with errors. Like if it's an error, like, I don't know, like I'm trying to create a directory that already exists, I don't care if it exists. I can just say ignore or silently continue over that and let my script kind of go on. So if I run this now, we should get a much cleaner output because I kind of suppressed all the noisy stuff that I didn't care about from that message. And then there was a way to legacy using some of the old batch file stream redirection commands to capture data. And that's what this ugly hack here is. He's literally saying, grab all streams and write host is considered a stream and redirect that to channel 1, which is standard output if you can save in a variable. It's ugly. Hopefully you don't have to do it. But if you need to look for it, it's managing output streams. So if I run this now, and I look at my, oh, so I can actually look at my data. I kind of was able to grab everything in that variable, even my error messages. And if I reach out and grab like the 4th item, he just so happened to have been the warning message, or I can grab the error message. Now your object's cluttered, but maybe that's what you wanted. Okay. So debug. This guy is annoying. So the debug option, or a special function just to test this, and I actually was talking to Snover about this, and he decided it was just implemented wrong. Like it's a bug the way it's implemented, but it's got a weird nuance. So the way test debug works, is by default, it's calling for both. If I don't say, show me the debug output, nothing happens. So when I run this guy here, I get my do something pipeline, do something else. So it's messages designed for the author of the script. Like so you might have stuff that like when they run it, the verbosity tells the consumer what they should know and the details to be aware of. But the debug is that second layer of, I wrote this and there's some weird nuances that when I'm having problems, I want to see this data. But maybe it's just too noisy or too much to present in my normal verbosity. So it's almost like double verbose. Yeah. That's how I've used it. I'll put it that way. So to show you what we're talking about is if I call test debug with the debug flag, instead of just seeing that output, we get the fun of actually saying yes or no to every single debug statement. Do I actually want to continue or not? And that's where the nuance is that is implemented wrongly. So do I want to continue with first debug message? Yes. Second debug message? Yes. And then third debug message? Yes. So if it's like a for each loop, that thing can get out of hand like insanely fast. But I do still use it on occasion because I know I can cheat with these verbose debug preferences. So instead of using this flag, my hack, if you will, is to just set the debug preference to show me what's happening inside that. So when I run this now, I actually get the verbose style messaging with all my output. So if you are going to use debug, this is my compromise on how I actually use it. And you'd think that if you're like debugging the script, that those messages would output. No, that's not the case. So if you're debugging the script, you have to flip one of those flags to have it write those messages as you're killing.
Also, there's a way to set a default for the what was it called? Variable preference. Like environment map or something. I forgot what it was, but you can make it so that anytime a confirm comes up, it's always going to set whatever.
I don't know of that globally, and I did just think of another hack to this, I guess. Yeah, never mind. I don't want to go off on that tangent. I'm going to come back. I'm going to talk about the confirm preferences, but I don't think it's doing quite what you have in mind. Returning value. So I already talked about how our test output just, places stuff on the pipeline. So when it runs, it falls through. There exists in PowerShell a return statement. And he's kind of deceiving, but in a normal function anyways, what happens is when you reach a return statement, that value will be basically tossed in the pipeline, returned back, and the function will effectively end. Like I'm done, return this value, don't continue on anymore. So it's like almost doing a throw without actually having an error. And so like this is a scenario where I'm going through a list of numbers, but as soon as I get to what I'm looking for, greater than 4, we'll return just that number. Which means he's going to break out of this for each loop. You can use a break statement here, like there's various things, but sometimes you have structure that says, I need to escape out of my function. And that's where I would use that. So if I load this function,
Was that the preferred method? Instead of using break.
So hit or miss. I definitely I personally like to write my logic so that stuff like runs all the way through. So I use more like if statements. So I'd say this is the value, but you'll run into performance scenarios where you're in the middle of a bunch of loops and you got to decide between using a break or using a return. But if I'm seeking something and I found it, and that's the sole purpose of my function, I'll use a return there every day. Then break has some weird nuances where, so if you have, break has bitten me a couple times only because I do lots of refactoring in my code. If you accidentally let a break escape a for each, it will break to the next for each. So I have a function that calls a function that calls a function, and he has a break statement in there that's not in a for each. It will break all the way out, which is an annoying thing to chase down and debug. But that's just more a nuance of the way I refactor a lot of my code. So as long as it's inside of a loop, the break will always break just that loop. Otherwise, it's like exit PowerShell.
The return has an effect on it. Make it to the specified return somewhere.
No and yes. No for general functions, like all the demos I'm doing today. Something gets in the pipeline and you return, it's all coming out. So that's why that's the nuance with return. But if you're in a class, like a class itself, you have to use return. Like nothing, the pipeline doesn't leak out of the class. You actually say, I return this value, I return nothing. And yeah, they're calling those methods. And that was a developer feature, and that was a lot of complaints that devs had coming to PowerShell is, I want to use the return statement, but stuff's not working right because I've got something that's leaking a true or a false, or something that's falling on my pipeline. It's like the disconnect between how the pipeline actually works in PowerShell and the way you come to it from other languages. So yeah, so test return, if I run that, I should only get the number that's greater than 4. And we'll notice I got a couple of verbose statements in here that shows I'm starting the counting and the end of the function. And by running it here, we'll see that the loop started, got to 5, and he was done. He never got to that final verbose statement. And then, here's almost the similar example where this is an example where it's leaking numbers in the pipeline, and you're still returning to break out of the function early. So let's return 2, 8, and then yeah, so all that stuff from the pipeline came out, and then we still returned. I'm not talking about classes in this talk. A lot of these same very similar things do apply to class methods, but as we get into more advanced features and parameter validation, things like that, they deviate quite a bit. Okay, part 2. I need a file. Okay, so features of actual advanced functions. Parameters. So we very briefly looked at parameters, but something that PowerShell offers are these parameter attributes. So I've got a function here that's a little bit more robust. Just a little more robust parameters where I'm saying, here's the type. Like this is a string, or it could be an integer, or a case custom object, or some other class for this variable. I suppose this is my syntax, the way I like to structure my lines. You can have these things on like one line, and this can be here on a single line as well. Like that syntax is definitely personal preference. What's also valuable to know is that parameters that could be like either true or false, you don't actually have to specify it as true. So this same thing is valid if I were to remove the true, to say that the first name or the first is a mandatory parameter. So if I run this and I test this, it's my full name here. It's kind of by default, it's doing positional parameters. I'll get on that, but you can control the positions. And then I'm doing the same thing where I'm using these names to specify specifically which strings. Yeah, I should definitely have these strings, I think. Sorry, this is my first time presenting this, so I'm trying all kinds of little things. Like, oh man, if I had just had that set, things would be more clear. Okay, so this here will output, and I can have these reversed since I'm specifying the names. So all 3 of these should output my name as expected. But if I don't specify them, because that one was mandatory, as long as I'm in an interactive shell, he's actually going to prompt me for that value. So a lot of controller scripts, people like to use read host to get inputs. I kind of actually prefer to use parameters and make them mandatory. So if they don't specify them in the prompted form, then they can enter them. And the reason why I like that over read host to get output or input is I can use the script for something else. I can actually automate and pass parameters in. But if you use write host, you can't do that. It's literally waiting for somebody on the host to count on the keyboard. It says, my script will not run with automation. And then the last one is optional, but if I leave off the primary one, it still asks me for it. So then, and then we can validate parameters. This is one of the cool features that PowerShell has, is these validators. So here's an example where I'm saying this number has to be between 100 and 200. Like that's what I'm going for here. So if I run this now, I'll get this nice clean message that says that the parameter number, the argument is less than the number allowed or the minimum, and tell me to supply it. So this is handling the help text for me. This is telling my user what was wrong with it by putting that one line, right? This could easily be 3 or 4 lines of I check and test this and I write a message to them. And this is PowerShell. Like this is localized for languages. So if somebody's on their German system, it'll tell them in German, your numbers are out of range. So you can take advantage of the PowerShell team building this validation for you. And so that's the range. You know, if I get a valid one, it's good. If it's too big, again, it'll tell me this one is just too large. Another super popular one that I use all the time is validate set. It's a way to say this value must be one of these 3 values and these 3 values alone. And so if we load this guy up and we run that, I get my red color because it was correct. But if I say a different color, not only do I get the error, but it actually tells me these are the values it should have been. So I'm telling there's the instant feedback to the end user without me writing that validation. I'm not going to test this set, but here's just a good collection. You can say, if it's a collection of things, how many should it be? Should it be like 5 things or 1 thing in the collection? The length, if it's a string, it has to be between 0 and 10 characters. Or if it's like an asset tag number, right? It's between 6 and 8 characters long. You could say, not null, or validate not null or empty. So funny thing, you can have property as mandatory, but a empty string can be supplied to mandatory parameters, right? So if you need to catch that scenario, you might want to do the validate not null or empty. They also support regex. So if you're a regex wizard and know regex, you can have that pattern. What I don't like is that when it has the error message, it says it does not match this regex pattern. So if your user can't read regex,
Yeah, I was wondering what the message would be like.
I think PowerShell 6 has added a message type parameter so that you can write a custom message for when validation fails. I haven't actually played with that yet, but I believe that made it into the release. And then you have the generic validate script. So you can actually write custom PowerShell in there to test and validate against something. I've seen a lot of people actually use the validate script to test the regex, and when it fails, they throw an error message. That was the PowerShell 5 older way to do it, was throw an error message in that test script, give them that feedback. It's ugly in a parameter, but you can do that. Parameter sets. So sometimes you need to have conditional input. Maybe I want computer name or IP address, but never both. So we can say the default parameter set is set name, just an arbitrary string. And I'm saying this parameter is part of name, and this one is other, and this last one is just a free-for-all. He'll exist in all sets, because I didn't limit him to any specific one. So if I load this function, and the rest of this is just verbose output here, and then because I'm using parameter sets, I can actually call this variable to know which set it actually decided to choose. So for example, if I run this one where I'm using the computer name localhost, I'll see, I'll see down here below, it said my parameter set was the name parameter set, there's a computer name with no IP address. I run on this one here, I'm getting the opposite, and if I run it with nothing, I'm not specifying something, I'm using the positional parameter for it to find it, because name was the default, it knew to put that value in the computer name. So if I decide to specify both, let's see what happens. Untested here, off script. It's saying it can't resolve which parameter set to use. Both of these, it can't make the determination because I provided both parameters.
I was just curious about how you have either the name or how is it? Is it because of the decision equals 0? I see at the top you say default parameter set equals name, and you have parameter set equals name. But how does the other?
So if I do,
Is it because of the position?
I do test parameters and parameter sets. Actually, we'll go through all of them. But I think it's by saying the defaults means if I only give it one parameter, it's first checking the default, and if since this guy matches a positional and it's mandatory,
I see. Okay.
he's kind of using that to get him there. If you're doing stuff over the, yeah, I'll talk about that. So yeah, he's definitely saying, try this one first. If we did this, let's say we hack this really fast and get rid of our defaults. Well, let's see what happens. You know what, I'm gonna throw the mandatory as well. These kind of causes problems. And going off scripts. I broke something. Position. Syntax is important. Okay. F8. So now if I run this, like I can't figure out which one to bind to. I gave it a name, it'd find it, but since I have two of them at position 0, it can't figure out. There is, I can't remember the names. I barely use this, but there are some like trace commands in PowerShell that if you're having weird parameter type binding type scenarios, you can turn on a trace because it was verbose. What it tried to match, what it ruled out for the function call as a way to figure out what actually happened in the end. You know, you can also have multiple parameter, like I don't have a good example on here, but thank you. You could do something like this. Make this guy part of both. Like this scenario is, if I specify computer name, because this guy is mandatory and part of the same set, I have to specify an IP address. Like I can force a second parameter. And so I can have different sets of rules on here. This gets complicated fast, and I've abused this in some of my DSL type function modules, but you can do this, doesn't necessarily mean you should. Okay, so what if? So what if support? If you want it, you can add a support should process attribute. You know, again, this is optional on there. And by using the PS command let should process, if I use the what if, it'll basically give me that message to show me what it would have done. So this is a scenario where if I run this normally, we are going to do something to target item, right? And I make that in red. So if I do this normally, you know, let's say we did some dangerous action, whatever it is. But if instead I say what if, it actually told me what it would have done based off of this should process name. So it does the operation, by default does the function name to target, and target is whatever variable I put in here. So that's how it came up with that sentence. I think you can add other things in here, other detail. Actually, there's different parameters to have those sentences changed a little bit, if that's not descriptive enough.
It's usually blocked for that.
Yes, because this guy's going to return a true or a false. So basically by should process being false, he's going to write the message, but also skip over that section of code. If in your function you are calling things system commandlets to support what if, like, so I don't actually have to put the should process on there if all I'm doing is copy item, because copy item supports what if, and I'll actually call it its what if. There are some gotchas there though, so you kind of gotta test that. Like if you're doing, I think you need the commandlets and or the native commands, it passes it perfectly like you'd expect it to. But if you have lots of custom modules, they call it custom modules, those don't pass between script modules. So there's kind of that gotcha between. The same with verbose. Like I have verbosity across different modules, and only this module verbosity will pass to its own functions. Once you call outside the module, it doesn't do verbose anymore. And then we also gain confirm support. So if I do a dash confirm, he's actually going to prompt me with that same message, do I want to continue? And I can say yes, and he does that action. So like controller scripts in those scenarios. Also, I'm not talking about pester much for testing your scripts, but I will add what if support to my functions just so I can have pester test everything else. So what it means is if I get this fairly large function, I got one piece in the middle that's dangerous, I'll make that the what if. So my test can call the function with the what if and go through most of the logic checking and never actually call the dangerous thing. Or maybe it's not dangerous. Maybe it just requires some third-party integration that I don't have access to when I'm testing it. You know, like going down the rabbit hole like DevOps, I'm doing, you know, I check into GitHub, some other server does the test. Well, if I need a TFS server, you know, GitHub build agent doesn't have my TFS server to access it. So there's things like that you could do to, mocking is another example. So down the path to confirm, we can also set a confirm impact of, say, hi, that says this is dangerous in that we should almost always prompt, or maybe you can set a confirm impact level on your system, and if it matches to this setting, it will selectively prompt you for that or not. So here, if I run this now, because I said the confirm impact is high, it's highly dangerous, it's always going to prompt me unless I override it. If you ever want to see what it is, the confirm preference variable by default is high. There's high, medium, and low. So some stuff might just be low impact, and you get that new scripter that's just scared of stuff. You're just not sure. He can set his impact to low, and he'll be like prompted for just about everything until he gets comfortable with the tooling. And then should continue is the case where I don't care what the confirm impact is. I'm always going to prompt to continue or not. And then I'm adding the ability to do a force here as well. So let me load this. So force is not a default one. You got to add that yourself. And if you want to support it, you always want to do force. You probably do like, I don't know, if you want true equals force if you want. And then the or statement. So if it finds that the force is true, it's going to evaluate the whole thing to true and not do the second command. So this is the way it's going to evaluate this and then go on, versus doing this and checking this. Because if this line executes, he's going to pause the script for you to actually hit yes or no. And I would still, if I'm doing the confirm or the should continue, I still put my should process what if inside that. Because you can actually test now your, I can do a what if and the confirm. I can do the what if and still prompt, but no, it's going to do a what if on the actual dangerous thing. So if I show that in action real quick. Confirm yes. Do I want to continue? If I force it, it just does it automatically. And then here's the what if scenario. So I do what if. He prompts me, yes, I want to continue. And then he lets me know what he would have done without actually performing. And that's kind of how you can kind of combine the two. Or we can force it and see what the what if would have been. And then how are we doing on time here? Pipeline. So accepting, so the good thing about functions, advanced functions, is they can accept pipeline input. You know, all your commandlets, many of them let you take an object, pipe it to your function. We can add support to it by using this value from pipeline in the parameter. So I suppose there's two things to call out if you want your function to support pipeline input. The first is you got to tell it which variable to put the data in. So that's what my parameter is doing, is the input object is the value from the pipeline. The second important thing is you got to specify a process block. This process almost becomes like a for each loop for the pipeline. So this will be basically execute once every time for every object. I'll show that in an example here, but if we run this right now, we load that up, and if I run this, we get my tests, and if I actually give it a list of things, my colors again, he's executing this whole block for every item. So like I said, in a way, he becomes a for each loop. That's how I think about him quite a bit. Is
Do you have to specify process though when you don't have to begin and end? Isn't it automatically
so
process?
it automatically makes that an end block.
Oh, does it?
So nope, that's good. So what happens is you'll get something like this. It looks like it works, right?
Which is gonna be a lot.
Gives you the last one, absolutely. So if I run my first test, because I'm testing with one item, it does what I thought it should do. But now I do this one here where I have multiple items, and it's only getting the last one, and I can't think of why. Like it's doing the last item because it's truly, he's an end block. And on my next example, I kind of highlight that even more, where I have a begin, process, and an end. And the way this works is if this is my for each loop, right? The begin will execute once before everything else, and it sets up what I need. Like maybe it's a COM object, or it's a certain set of variables that are common across everything in the begin. And then the end will execute once after everything is done. So you can, what I would usually use that for is if my process needs to add stuff to a collection, I need to work on the whole list as a whole. I'll collect it in the process, and in the end, I will for each it, loop, concat, do whatever I need to do, and spit out what I need at the end. So it's like process to collect, and to actually deal with the whole set of data. So if we run this guy, we'll see that yeah, so we did the begin, one process block, and then the end. Then where do I go from here? So then, knowing that, one pattern I use a lot, all the time, is I'll make my input object a collection. And I'll actually put a for each inside my process block. And what this lets me do is accept both either data over the pipeline or give me the object as give me this whole set of data as that parameter. So it almost makes my code act kind of the same way. So instead of doing the for each on the process, I do the for each on the object. Somebody love this guy to kind of show what happens here. But the big difference is, like I said, we know we're calling the process block once for each item. So we're actually re-entering the whole loop. But if I do it on just input object, if I do it as a parameter, my start process only happened once, but my loop happened for each one of them. And this kind of it helps align my code. It's very similar across all those different scenarios. So that's how I feel like a fat object, you want to grab it and treat it as a whole inside your pipeline. There's a second way to accept pipeline input, and that's by property name. So maybe our property has different attributes, our object has different attributes on it, so I want to map them to parameters. So this is a case where I've got a person that has a name and an age, and I don't want the person object. I just want to get the values off the object. So I'm kind of like doing a mapping here. So in this case, let me run this real fast. F8. So here's my object, for example, right? I've got a name and an age, and because I did by property name, and I pipe this in, it's going to match those up, and it basically shove those into those variables for me. And that's what a lot of commandlets do. That's probably the way you should do most of them. I'd probably fall back on the full object more so than I should, but So going from that, a fun, interesting tip, I guess, is you might actually have names that don't align. Like what if you accept a name with the object as first name? If it's not a function that you can control, like if I run this guy first, we'll see that, he did not find that property. He gave me a null value there and it's empty. You can actually use a script block to change the values in line. So here I'm saying on the input object, dot first name, pass it to the name value. And it'll execute that for each one of them. And so when I run this here, I was actually able to kind of like remap that value. This is great for functions that you don't have access to modify. So then if we do have control, we can actually add an alias to our own commands, and it will now find either or. If I have the first name on the object or the name on the object, it'll put those in the value for me. So if I go this, and then pipeline by alias, it found by first name because I use an alias property. So I jumped over it really fast, but this is a syntax for doing alias. And you can actually have multiple aliases on any properties. No. I don't know if, yeah. I think there might be a nuance here, but so. And then comment-based help. Can't talk about functions without talking about comment-based help. So you can add inline to your functions syntax just like this that starts with the beginning block comment and end block comment. And this is where, like, if you put this documentation inside your function, you can do a get help on it, and they'll get that back out. So it becomes portable. There's different places you can put the help text, but I always place it inside the function because they're going to copy my function as a whole. If I place the help text out above, somebody's going to copy and paste my code and leave that behind. So it almost forces them by default to the easy thing is place it in here. So these are well-known properties: synopsis, description, example, personal habit. I always have an example. In fact, I write lots of modules, lots of functions. I have pester tests for testing and validation. One set of tests that I have is, do my functions have help text? If they don't, I can't check in my code yet. Do they have an example? I can't check in my code without an example. And that rule applies to the whole team, right? So my build will fail, the check-in will fail, unless I can validate a couple of these properties. There's nothing more frustrating than having a function like, I don't know how to use it. And I always recommend the most minimal possible example to make it run, and then probably the ideal syntax. So if we run this guy really fast here, if I do a get help on my test help, we'll see the description synopsis. The description shows up here. And if I ask for just examples, I can see right away. I love having a copy and paste example. Like if I have something in my organization, I'll just do that, copy, paste it. I tweak the variables a little bit, and it's off and running. It's almost like documentation right there at your fingertips. And then I glaze over it, but you can actually put your comments right here, just above your parameter, and those will make it in your help text as well. So if I do this is the first name of the customer, and I ask for just the first name, you will see that that is the help test text.
All you have to do is put a pointer above it.
Yep. There's a second syntax that does like, right, dots, parameter, something. There's another syntax in there, but oh, I was missing the name, wasn't I? There it is. So if I move this out now, our customer, just to prove that it changes. And run that whole section, F8. And take a peek at it. Wait, I just need this one. Where is it? Oh, first name. I actually got to type the variable right. Okay. So F8s and F8s. There it is, our customer. So those are both supported syntax for junior parameters. Then, okay, so I want to revisit quickly our okay. So revisiting our save shortcut function, right? Our new shortcut. I'm gonna kind of show you like my workflow here for like creating this advanced function, or show what this guy could be. You know, and ideally, I want these two syntaxes to be able to call it with these parameters, or be able to pipeline to the function. So let's in this project, I do have a snippet. This is my snippet for making new functions, and I like using snippets because it lets you produce lots of functions really fast. So creates a new shortcut. And that's VS Code doing this. ISC supports snippets as well. Yeah, so okay. So now I've got my body. This is like my pattern. We want to duplicate this because I want both a path and a destination. Now I want single strings. I'm going to do pipeline by name always versus an array in this collection. Position 1. Source file. Location to something. And then I look at my snippet here. Let's see, I think this guy here probably belongs in a begin statement. Oh, look, I've got a begin statement. And this guy here goes in the middle. And shortcut, let's say this guy's path. That was destination. Is that my function? I think it is. Let's do a little verbosity on that. Verbose. Saving. I like to do brackets around all my variables, so I know when they're null or they're spaces or whatever. So I'll often do saving path destination, shortcut to path and destination. I like that. So now it feels pretty well fleshed out. So let me run this guy, F8, no errors. Now, does this syntax work? Oh no, I missed something. What did I miss? Argument parameter path. Oh, did I not do enough? You're right, let me load these two. Oh, demigods, all right. Oh, I'm at these swapped. I do. All right. All right, load the whole. That load, I think it did. All right, where's my cleanup? Did it actually create it? Let's run this again just to prove it's doing it. Perfect. Now let's test my pipeline input. Excellent. I had verbose on there, so I see all the outputs. And you know what? I got two examples here. Let's put those in my function. So there's my 0 to 60, I guess, in creating
on your VS Code,
yeah.
how do you get the like where you're at in the script, like how you're selecting that new shortcut script block right there? Yeah, how do you get to that?
Oh, that is, there's a user settings feature you can turn on. It's new like a month and a half ago. So it's a fairly new feature. Beautiful in JSON files. Yeah, large JSON file, it works, breadcrumbs work in there as well. Okay, so this is production ready. That's kind of why I went into my demo off. I suppose if we have any questions. Yeah, any questions from here? Well, I wanted to show this thing at the end just so it's like, I can, I already function a lot, right? So I can turn them out really fast. Like once you get that pattern down, it's parameter, body, save. And if you have a snippet that creates that shell around that, then the ability to turn out functions really fast and really easily is kind of mitigated. And then actually, I did my examples here, and I did leave off a step, code where I do the new shortcut tests. Tester it. Now, I have a snippet for my tester test.
So I got a question on the tester test, just real quick. How do you know like the syntax? Is there obviously that one's pretty easy, like you should not throw.
I think they're.
Can you just put anything in that like?
Actually, yeah. So that, that's inside that is a script block. So actually, these are. I have another talk on this, but these are just functions, like describe, autocomplete, name this thing, and then fixture, kind of ugly. This is a script block. So anything you can put anything you want inside that. Even so, on the notes, you can do for each node in 1.10. If you need to do tests on collections of things, like just knowing that that is just PowerShell, and those are functions inside that. I think I'll run through there's a couple things. I think their webpage, there's a wiki page that talks about most of the commands. I think those initial examples are pretty good to work with. If you're curious, I do have another talk I did a long time ago. Actually, maybe I should just I could probably put that on the agenda for this group, because I don't think I've talked to it here. But I have a tester in action that basically starts with a basic script, like, I don't know, something like creating a shortcut, and then adds tests along the way. So as I grow this script, it's a different talk. I make the script more and more complex. I add tests to validate as I grow with it. So then I suppose the one thing I didn't talk about was where to put these functions. If you save them in a PSM1 file as a module, you can just do import module in that file, and it loads them in. And if you take the next step, in your PS module path, there's a like user documents modules folder. Create a folder named other, and a file named other.psm1, and put your functions in there, and then they'll just load from your shell. So all of a sudden they just become commands at the console you can use. And so we probably have, God, how many modules do I have? We have lots of modules here. What?
How do you name modules? You use that same verb.
Modules, I like them more distinct and on topic. So here's our modules at work. So we do prefix with our company. Okay, I think 5 of these are different repos, but I think all of these right through here are definitely modules for sure.
Still like it. PS.
All tough call. Like I find, so like PS Graph is one of mine, PS Graph Plus. I'm starting to do more like micro modules where I have this really great function and making a module just for that function. Like I've got a depends on. There's like this dependency tree type thing. I have a chronometer one. So I try to be a little bit unique with them, but if I can find the name that feels most representative, let's see, I just made one that's like an npm PS. I'm torn. Should the PS be in front, PS be after? Or even should I have the PS on there, right? Like it's,
Struggle.
naming is about probably my most difficult thing in all of computer science, is finding the right names for stuff. I will say though, keeping your functions smaller lets you use a lot simpler variables, right? Like if I've got a function only like 10 lines long and I'm dealing with a customer or a user, like I don't have to say like the first user, the last user, the next user. Like all of a sudden your variables can be simpler because you don't got to use them for they're in and out of scope so fast. That's another thing I love making smaller functions for, is makes my naming so much easier.